Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to take a moment to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Dawn Flanagan is a professor of psychology at St. John's University and affiliate clinical professor at the Yale Child Study Center. She's authored numerous books, including the one she has pictured here, Essentials of WISC-5 Assessment. And of course, she's the author of an author on Cross-Battery Assessment Software System, or XBAS. Also, Dawn recently received an award from APA Division 16, the inaugural Contributions to Practice Award. And certainly she's made significant contributions to the practice of LD assessment here in Texas and around other places. In fact, she's been a frequent speaker and consultant to our special education evaluators in Texas for well over a decade. So we're really pleased that we have her today to talk about WISC-5 and some case studies using that test and XBAS. So I'll turn it over to Dawn.
Thank you, Denise. Hello, everybody. I'm going to be talking about use of the WISC-5, particularly using it with XBAS. And the case study I have is one that's related to a student who has significant math difficulties. So let me just begin by talking about a few points that I'm going to address during today's presentation. So I'll talk about SLD identification and using the WISC-5, KT3, and KeyMath3. I'll address some foundational sources of information that are necessary for making informed decisions about PSW methods for SLD identification. I'll briefly describe the dual discrepancy consistency method, which is the PSW method that my colleagues and I advocate. And then I will show data from a case study entered into XBAS and walk through the XBAS system and talk about how data are interpreted following the DDC model in XBAS. And then I will end with diagnostic impressions related to that case. So before beginning, I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. There's some misconceptions about cross-battery assessment and PSW. The terms are being used interchangeably, but they're actually two different things. Cross-battery assessment is a method of systematically augmenting any core battery to measure abilities that are not measured by that core battery. And it provides a set of guidelines, principles, and procedures to allow data to be integrated across batteries in a manner that is psychometrically and theoretically defensible. And so cross-battery assessment is about measurement. It's about evaluation. Whereas the DDC model is once you have your data and you've done your comprehensive evaluation, do those data suggest that the student or individual has a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that is indeed consistent with the SLD construct. And the program XBAS allows you to organize data and integrate and interpret data following cross-battery principles and procedures. And it also allows you to use those data in a PSW analysis. But the cross-battery assessment method is a standalone method, and the PSW method is a standalone method. So they shouldn't be used interchangeably, but it's understandable why they have been, because they're very closely associated with one another, primarily because you often need cross-battery data whenever you do an evaluation of SLD, particularly when you're following up on aberrant score performances, testing hypotheses, and so forth. Another area I just wanted to address very briefly is this whole issue about using formulas for diagnosis of specific learning disability. And we all remember ability achievement discrepancy and, discrepancy LD, no discrepancy non-LD. Formulas, sort of really get us into trouble when we use them as a method of diagnosis. the bottom line is that tests do not diagnose. So a WJ4 or a WISC-5, they don't diagnose a learning disability. XFAS doesn't diagnose a learning disability. Clinicians do, educational evaluators, school psychologists, clinical psychologists, neuropsychologists. We evaluate and diagnose learning disabilities based on a convergence of data sources. And so we get valuable information from our assessment tools like the WISC-5. We get valuable information from looking at our data to discern patterns in the data. That's through PSW methods, for example. We get valuable information from qualitative data sources, teacher reports, parent reports, work samples, and we look at all data sources gathered through multiple methods, and we look for a convergence of indicators. Do all data sources appear to be consistent and support the SLD construct? And so we as clinicians actually make that diagnosis rather than any program. And I think it's important to understand that and try not to use programs in that way or rely too heavily on programs. It's our own clinical thinking and judgment and consideration of how all data converge that I think is most important in that determination. The definition that we follow primarily is the IDEA, which is a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. So in the PSW model, a disorder in a basic psychological process is part of that procedure. Federal regulations allow for different procedures. The one that I'm focusing on today is the alternative research-based approach, or the PSW model. According to the federal regulations, evaluation documentation must consider whether the student exhibits a pattern of strengths and weaknesses in performance, achievement, or both, relative to age, state-approved grade level standards, or intellectual development that is determined by the group to be relevant to the identification of SLD using appropriate instruments. Now, I think that there's a number of different foundational sources of information that are necessary to understand or have access to in order to inform the results of any PSW analysis. So, for example, interpretation of PSW requires an understanding of contemporary theory. The theory that I rely on the most and use in interpretive methods is CHC theory, the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory. Interpretation of PSW also requires an understanding of the theoretical constructs that are measured by cognitive batteries. So if you're using a WISC-5, you need to understand what that WISC-5 measures according to a theoretical model or multiple theoretical models, depending on your background and how schooled you are, if you will, in different theoretical approaches. Interpreting PSW also requires an understanding of cognitive processes and abilities related to achievement. So there's a consistency piece to PSW, which is that the area of, the assumption is that the area of academic skill deficit, the reason that there are academic skill deficiencies despite good instruction is because of cognitive processing deficits that are closely related to that academic skill deficit. So there are different cognitive processes and abilities that are related to different academic areas, and it's important to understand those connections so that we can properly interpret the consistency part of the PSW approach. Interpretation of PSW, it may require cross-battery assessment to assess all the abilities and processes considered important based on the referral, or to follow up on hypotheses, aberrant score performances, etc. So oftentimes, as I said, you have to go out of battery in order to measure the full range of processes that have been found to be closely associated with the academic area in question. And it also requires an understanding of the SLD construct, right? So we follow the federal definition, and there's also a set of common diagnostic markers for specific learning disability that is part of our operational definition of specific learning disability and therefore part of our PSW model, which I'll talk about. So the guiding theory that I'm using is the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory, comprised of 16 broad cognitive abilities and over 80 narrow abilities. The core battery today that we're focusing on is the WISC-5, and the WISC-5 measures the primary index scales measure 5 aspects of 5 broad cognitive abilities: crystallized intelligence, visual processing, fluid reasoning, short-term memory, and processing speed. There's also ancillary index scales and complementary index scales. The complementary index scales in particular, I think, are really critical for the assessment of individuals suspected of having a specific learning disability. We know from a lot of different research studies coming out of different disciplines that retrieval abilities and learning efficiency abilities are important for learning and achievement. And so any individual who's referred for a specific learning disability ought to be given these complementary index scales. There are 10 new clinical composites which are based on actual norms, so the norms, the WISC-5 norms. They're calculated automatically on the WISC-5 tab in XPath. We also include them as tables, so norm tables and essentials of WISC-5 assessment. So just very briefly, there are some new clinical composites: vocabulary plus information. They require less verbal expression as compared to the other tests. They can also be thought of as retrieval from remote long-term storage. There's similarities in comprehension, which requires greater verbal expression. It also may require more reasoning ability. There's a combination of crystallized and fluid tests that provide an alternative to the full-scale IQ and the General Ability Index, which is the GFGC composite. There's an alternative working memory composite, which basically takes out digit span forward, so more of a pure kind of memory span test. Digit span forward takes that out and puts together digit span backwards, digit span sequencing, and letter number sequencing. There's a memory span working memory composite, which is like the WISC-4 memory composite. So it's digit span forward and digit span backward. There's a working memory what we consider high cognitive complexity. So cognitively complex tasks that require working memory, so arithmetic and picture span. There's an expanded verbal crystallized index. This came out of a technical report done by Susan Rayford and colleagues. So it's all of the GC tests combined. So it's a 4 subtest GC composite. There's an expanded fluid reasoning or fluid index. Same report by Rayford and colleagues. Matrix reasoning, figure weights, picture concepts, and arithmetic. There's an alternative to processing speed, so symbol search plus cancellation. And the idea there was to eliminate the memory and motor dexterity demands that are inherent mainly in the coding subtest. And then there's delayed symbol translation and recognition symbol translation, which provides an estimate of the individual's ability to retrieve recently encoded information from long-term stores. And so that can be compared, so that particular clinical composite can be compared to this composite here, the verbal expression low composite, which is retrieval from remote long-term stores. So remote long-term stores versus recent long-term stores. So that's a comparison that may be important. And it's described in the chapter written by George McCloskey in Essentials of WISC-5 Assessment. Now, anytime you do an evaluation, a comprehensive evaluation, initial evaluation for an individual suspected of having a learning disability, it's important to represent in the individual's functioning across these 7 areas: fluid, crystallized, long-term storage and retrieval, short-term memory, visual processing, auditory processing, and processing speed. The reason for that is that there is evidence of significant positive relationships between these cognitive abilities and processes and specific academic skills. And most of these broad cognitive abilities contain or are made up of narrow abilities that have differential relationships with reading, math, and written language skills. We also know that cognitive processing weaknesses manifest in real-world performances. So we see general manifestations of cognitive processing weaknesses, and we also see very specific manifestations of these processing weaknesses in reading, math, and writing achievement, and particularly in the classroom setting or in a learning setting. Now, to do a PSW analysis following the dual discrepancy consistency model, again, the one used in XFAS, it requires that you have an estimate of 7 cognitive abilities and processes. Again, the ones that I just mentioned, so the ones bulleted here. Now, these 7 broad cognitive abilities and processes encompass about 20 frequently measured abilities and processes. So there's a lot of narrow abilities that are dispersed, if you will, across those 7 areas. And those 7 estimates of these 7 areas are necessary for the calculation of some scores that are used uniquely in the dual discrepancy consistency model by XFAS. So they're used to calculate what we call a G value and what we call the FCC, the facilitating cognitive composite, which is made up of the individual's cognitive strengths, so it's a summary of the individual's strengths, and the inhibiting cognitive composite, which is a summary score of the individual's weaknesses. Now, we also allow for other areas to be evaluated within the context of the RPSW model in XFAS. So executive functions, orthographic processing, speed of lexical access, cognitive efficiency. These are all additional areas that are not, that don't really have a nice little home in CHC theory, but are nevertheless important processes that are often evaluated within the context of SLD evaluation. Now, I also want to make it clear that there's really not a need to have broad cognitive ability estimates in all areas. Backing up to the early 2000s and the way that tests were constructed back then and the way that we were talking about cross-battery back then and the way that the research was unfolding back then, the focus was at the broad ability level. So it was really important to try to strive for 2 qualitatively different indicators of each broad ability so that the aggregate or the composite could be interpreted appropriately. In other words, with at least 2 or more qualitatively different indicators of the broad ability, so subtests that measure different aspects of the broad ability, that composite, you could draw inferences from that composite about the broader ability. So inductive reasoning, deductive reasoning, that composite will allow you to draw inferences about the broad GF ability, fluid reasoning. But in some areas, it's really not. It's not easy to get a broad ability composite. The broad ability composites are fairly typical and can be achieved most readily in the areas of GF, GC, and GV, because that's how our tests are constructed. But there are times when you can't get a broad ability composite. For example, most of the time GA is difficult to find qualitatively different indicators of GA. A lot of the GA kinds of abilities are measured by audiologists. They're much more specific than what it is that we do, and we do more of the phonetic coding analysis, phonetic coding synthesis. So oftentimes our GA is a phonetic coding composite, which is okay. Oftentimes our processing speed is like a composite of perceptual speed, which again is okay because we don't have a lot of qualitatively different indicators. And when we start getting into the academic fluency areas, then we're measuring more manifest kinds of abilities rather than cognitive processes. More than one CHC estimate is okay as well. So this happens a lot in the area of GLR because learning efficiency abilities are very different than retrieval fluency abilities. So oftentimes you may have a learning efficiency composite, let's say a composite made up of associative memory, meaningful memory, and then you may have a retrieval fluency composite, one that's made up of naming facility or ideational fluency or word fluency. And so you may have two different composites within a broad domain. One could be a strength, the other could be a weakness. That's fine too. So the idea is that there are 7 broad cognitive abilities that ought to be assessed at a minimum, and it's important to estimate broad abilities whenever possible, but acknowledge that because we're evaluating children who struggle in the learning process, we often have a lot of variation within broad areas. So we follow up on some variation, particularly when it's low, and we may end up with 2 composites, and that's okay. So there's more flexibility there than I think people realize, especially those who have been following and doing cross-matter assessment for a while. And I hope to be able to demonstrate some of that with the case study. So let me talk about just conceptually what PSW is. So a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that's consistent with the SLD construct. There are a few different PSW models out there, and they all have a few things in common. So there are some conceptual similarities. The first being that all PSW models indicate that there needs to be evidence of a cognitive weakness or cognitive deficit. So right back to the federal definition, a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes. All PSW models indicate that there needs to be evidence of academic skill weakness or failure, because that's how the cognitive processes manifest. They manifest in a disruption in the acquisition of basic skills and the development of those skills. So, and there ought to be a consistency between the cognitive processes and the cognitive processing weaknesses and the academic skill weaknesses. That is, that there's some empirically established or ecological validity for that relationship. There's also agreement that there needs to be some cognitive areas of strength, some integrity, some spared abilities, if you will. Historically, SLD has always been described as a condition where you have circumscribed cognitive processing weaknesses within a sea of strength or that stand in stark contrast to the individual's other obvious capabilities. So the cognitive strengths are important as well. So there's agreement on all of those factors. Also, these discrepancies here between the cognitive strengths and the cognitive weaknesses and the cognitive strengths and the academic weaknesses, well, there needs to be statistically significant differences here, and the reason for that is to demonstrate that these are indeed reliable differences, that these differences are not due to chance. And that's basically where the, where that agreement is. It's at the conceptual level. The reason it's at the conceptual level is because there are different models, and all models are operationalized differently. So what some think, some define cognitive weakness different than others. Some define academic weakness different than others. Some define discrepancy different than others. What is a cognitive strength in the context of specific learning disabilities? Which cognitive areas? How many? So there's a lot of different ways to operationalize PSW, and I would encourage you to look at different PSW models to see how they are operationalized so that you can have a good understanding of just the nuances and the differences between them and which one seems to make the most sense within the context of SLD identification. Okay, so again, I'll talk about the dual discrepancy consistency PSW model. Our operational definition, there's 5 levels to our definition, and it's basically at level 1, we're talking about an academic weakness. We don't set cutoffs. We follow base rate data, which we'll get to a little bit later. But we really don't set cutoffs. We just give some recommendations, some guidelines. Yeah, if you have below average performance, we're just talking about sort of a first pass, right? We're trying to get a sense of, does this child meet criteria for specific learning disability? Are we likely looking at a child who has a specific learning disability? Well, do they have poor academic performance? Is it below average? That's sort of the first pass. In our model, however, that performance, wherever it may be, however you define it as being problematic, also needs to meet criteria for unexpected underachievement. For us, unexpected underachievement is a diagnostic marker. And we use regression analysis to determine unexpected underachievement, which is why you need XFAS to evaluate the pattern. Exclusionary factors are very important, and ruling out the primary cause, or the primary causes of the academic skill deficiencies are really important, and it must be done in a systematic way and in a way that has accountability. The evaluation of exclusionary factors is as important as the evaluation of cognitive abilities and processes. Now, oftentimes some exclusionary factors are contributory, and it's important to understand those as well because they should be then included in any intervention plan following the evaluation. Level 3 is about cognitive weaknesses, really treated in the same way as academic weaknesses. Are there any performances that stand out as low, below average? That's sort of, again, the first pass. Yeah, this is looking consistent with a specific learning disability. We're seeing some cognitive processing weaknesses. However, in order to meet criteria, the cognitive processing weaknesses must also be considered domain-specific. That means that they're more circumscribed and they are significantly different in an unusual way from the areas of cognitive strength. Generally, low average ability across the board is not domain-specific cognitive weaknesses, right? It's not a specific learning disability. So we have to differentiate SLD from more generalized learning difficulty, and so that this particular component, the domain-specific component, allows for that differentiation. Level 4 is basically pulling all the data together, the quantitative data together. So it's a dual discrepancy consistency model. So there are two discrepancies and a consistency. And so the first discrepancy is the difference between the cognitive strengths, that is the top oval, and is that difference between the cognitive strengths and the cognitive weaknesses, is that difference significant? If it is significant, then what our program does is it uses what we call, again, the facilitating cognitive composite, or the summary of the individual's cognitive strengths. It uses that FCC to predict where the person is expected to perform in that cognitive area that you deemed a weakness. And then it looks at the difference between predicted and actual performance. And if that difference occurs in about 10% or less of the population, then the cognitive weakness meets the criterion for domain-specific. So it's a domain-specific cognitive weakness. The second discrepancy is the difference between the cognitive strengths, or the facilitating cognitive composite, and the academic area that you indicated was a weakness. And if that difference needs to be statistically significant, showing that it is a real difference, and when it is, then the FCC is used in a regression-based analysis to predict where that person was expected to perform in that area of achievement. And if that difference between predicted and expected is unusual in the general population, then that supports unexpected underachievement. And then the next piece that comes in is the consistency piece, and that is there an empirical or ecologically valid relationship between your cognitive area of weakness or weaknesses and your academic area of weaknesses? And that requires an understanding of the research on those relationships. XBAS builds in that it looks at it, the program knows what you selected as a cognitive weakness, it knows what you selected as an academic weakness, and it uses the research to inform that consistency. In other words, it will tell you if that relationship is low, moderate, or high. So it aids in the consistency piece. Now, there's been some research. There was a study published recently by Kranzler and colleagues, and it was a study that talked about XBA, but it really wasn't XBA. It was the BDC model. It was not operationalized correctly in this study, but that's actually not the point. It talked about diagnostic misses. And one of the things that it assumed, that this research assumed, was that this relationship between cognitive abilities and academic weaknesses, so the consistency piece, that it's a causal relationship and causal deterministic was the assumption. So in other words, if you have a cognitive processing weakness, you will have an academic weakness. And if you have an academic weakness, you will have a cognitive processing weakness. And if you don't, in either direction, it's a diagnostic miss. Well, that actually misses the whole point of PSW analysis, SLD, and what this entire process is all about. So the relationship comes primarily from correlational data. It is causal in nature, but causal probabilistic, okay? So what that means is cognitive processing weaknesses raise the risk of academic skill weaknesses, but they do not guarantee them. There are children all over our schools with cognitive processing weaknesses who never make it into our offices and for a full evaluation. And the reason is because they have a lot of really good capabilities and they figured out ways around their cognitive weaknesses such that they're functioning quite well at grade level. We also have a lot of individuals, a lot of students who do not have cognitive processing weaknesses, but who have academic skill weaknesses. Why? Because so many factors can be inhibiting factors to academic success. Social, emotional, psychological, environmental, and so forth. So keep in mind that cognitive processing weaknesses raise the risk of academic skill weaknesses. They do not guarantee them. So don't assume a perfect prediction. It's not there. Okay. Now, let me move into a case. This is a Holly. She's 9 years old, and she's in 5th grade. She was retained in the 1st grade. She's received tutoring in math for quite a while. It's pretty clear that the tutoring is not actually remedial in any sense, but more help with homework. She uses manipulatives to assist her in math. She needs extra time on assessments and tests, particularly in math. She's failed the state math exams in grades 3, 4, and 5. Her math fluency is poor. Her progress monitoring shows mainly addition probes, slow performance, frequent errors. And reading and writing have been fine. She's been able to pass her reading and writing, so she's performing at grade level. Previous evaluations do not show any difficulty in reading and writing, and her teacher reports are fine in terms of her reading and writing. Dibble shows well below benchmark throughout grade 5 in computation, even though she's been in interventions for 2 years. She has a lot of evidence of math difficulty from KT3 error analyses. Her WISC 5 appears to show some circumscribed weaknesses with generally average ability to think and reason. So that's sort of a snapshot of where Holly is. Her primary area of concern is math fluency. She's having a lot of difficulty with math fluency. She's very slow. She's the last to finish. Progress monitoring data are really not showing improvement. She uses inefficient strategies to solve problems, and recently she's only demonstrated a couple of instances of correct regrouping. This slide shows her Dibble's progress monitoring, and it shows that she has been well below benchmark all throughout 5th grade, despite intervention. Here's an example of some problems and how she solves problems. So following the RTI, what would be a typical battery that an individual might use or evaluator might use? Well, what I've seen a lot of is administer the WISC 5, make sure you get the 5 primary index scales. So that would be 10 subtests. Some only administer 7 for the purpose of getting a full-scale IQ. The Wyatt 3 is usually administered to cover all of the 8 areas of SLD, and sometimes the CTOP is used to get more specific information about phonological processing, phonemic awareness, and so forth. So that's about 26 subtests, which is not atypical, rather very typical, for a comprehensive evaluation for specific learning disability. However, I'm not sure it's the best use of time in terms of trying to figure out what's happening where Holly's concerned. So what's missing are more diagnostic kinds of math tests, long-term storage and retrieval, and some executive functions, some that are specifically related to math achievement. And so with approximately the same number of tests, which is this evaluation that I'm presenting now, 25 subtests, you can get a lot more information that's more tailored and specific to Holly's learning needs. So there's a hypothesis, obviously, on the table that this may be dyscalculia or an SLD in math calculation and or math problem solving. It certainly is appearing that way given failure to respond to the instruction and the remedial techniques used in the RTI service delivery model, given her work samples, teacher reports, the length of time that it has taken her to get to make even the slightest amount of progress, her very, very poor fluency, and so forth. We know that SLD has neurobiological influences. It's a brain-based disorder, and it's defined by specific cognitive processing weaknesses. So if we look at the particular math areas like number sense, memorization of math facts, and so forth, brain regions associated with basic processing of numerical information are structurally and functionally distinct from those involved in math calculation and math problem solving. So it suggests that we need to measure these areas in addition to math calculation and math problem solving. There are areas of the brain that have been uniquely associated with math calculation. So there's a lot of research to support that, and these are obviously more information on the slides for you. And it's likely that an entire network of brain regions is implicated in math problem solving. And also it's interesting that some studies have found that individuals with dyscalculia have structural abnormalities in the parietal cortex. So there's definitely brain-based relationships related to math achievement. Now, what this slide shows is sort of a combination of the processes and associated impairments from both CHC and neuropsych literature. So you see on the left-hand side, you see the 7 areas. And then in the math achievement column, you see narrow abilities within those specific areas that are closely associated with math achievement, and then the etiology of math function. And so the idea is that when we set out to do an evaluation, we want to ensure that we're including tests that measure the different abilities and processes that are most important for understanding math learning disability. And so math disorders are associated with weaknesses in fundamental number representation and processing, which manifest in difficulties with quantifying steps without counting, using nonverbal processes to complete simple numerical operations, estimating the relative magnitude of sets. All of these are in the math area of number sense. Math disorders are also associated with difficulties with number comparisons, difficulties with long-term retrieval, impaired fluency. In terms of manifestations, using procedural strategies rather than memory-based strategies. So it's really important to understand these as well, because we often don't really spend a lot of time looking for manifestations of the processes that are involved in specific math disorders. So if we understood the processes that are involved, we would be better able to recognize their manifestations. Other associated impairments, processing speed. So we already talked about, this is for accurate and fluent calculation, so long-term retrieval is also implicated there, as is rapid naming, but also processing speed, which contributes to poor math calculation fluency. And then for math problem solving, in addition to, you have working memory, in addition to working memory, visual spatial ability, attention, and executive function, so more higher level kinds of abilities for math problem solving, which makes sense. So what this slide shows is kind of putting it all together. So we have the math areas, right? So if we're trying to understand math disorders or math learning disability, we need to focus on number sense, memorization of math facts, accurate and fluent calculation, and math problem solving. And so there are some skills and processes involved in those areas. And then there's our measurement of those processes. And then there's the manifestations of those skills that are involved and processes that are involved. And so they all come together. And when I talk about a convergence of indicators, that's what I'm speaking about. So the measurement of these processes and how they manifest for the individual. So in terms of quantifying steps without counting, which is referred to as subitizing, the WISC-5 has a very specific test that gets at that. It's called naming speed quantity. And also looking at number sense, the KT3 Math Concepts and Applications test There's the number concept error analysis category, which is important to look at when you're looking at number sense. Using nonverbal processes to complete numerical operations, key math, numeration and algebra subtests. Those are basic concept kinds of tests. Also, from more of a qualitative standpoint, Holly uses manipulative. She uses hash marks to solve addition problems. She has difficulty using operational properties, order of operations, and related symbolism to compute with whole and rational numbers. So she has a lot of manifestations of those difficulties using nonverbal processes. Estimating the relative magnitude of sets, that's key math, the mental computation and estimation, which is an operations test. And she's also been observed having difficulties estimating. So this was an in-class activity where you had to compare jars with marbles in it and determine which ones had, which jar had the most marbles, so it was a comparison task. She had a lot of difficulty with that task, according to her teacher. Number comparisons, key math numeration, and also teacher reported inconsistent ability to correctly identify the largest number among a set of numbers, which was a timed sheet worksheet or activity. So there's a lot of evidence that she's having difficulty, or she has difficulty with number sense, some basic concepts in the area of math. In terms of memorization and math facts, so long-term storage and retrieval, well, the WISC-5 measures both aspects of long-term memory. So it measures the learning efficiency aspect through its associative memory test, and it also measures the retrieval fluency aspect through naming speed literacy and naming speed quantity. So you have both aspects of GLR that's measured there. What's interesting is that we know that Holly can make associations and encode information and encode it well enough to the point where it's consolidated in long-term memory, and she's demonstrated that on WISC tests, but she has a lot of difficulty doing that, particularly when she's working with numbers. So the KT3 math concepts and applications subtest, fact or computation error analysis would be important to do to look at that. She's also a lot of observations. She counts on her fingers. She has difficulty remembering phrases associated with addition. So when she's doing word problems, it becomes very difficult for her because she forgets that add, sum, increase by, together all mean, addition. Same with subtraction. Our teacher also reported that she needs more time and error-free repetition, right? So she needs a lot of error-free repetitions and much more than most students for that information to be consolidated. And the teacher reports even after several error-free repetitions, sometimes that information is lost. So that's all related to the long-term retrieval component. Impaired math fluency. So KT3 math fluency, one of the biggest areas of concern is her math fluency, and she has very slow performance on fluency drills in class. Her progress monitoring probe showed very poor fluency in addition. Using procedural strategies rather than memory-based strategies. Key math, mental computation and estimation, and she's observed, she does use strategies. She benefits from strategies. She does get some strategy instruction, and she has been observed using those kinds of strategies. In terms of accurate and fluent calculation, again, long-term storage and retrieval comes into play. Rapid naming, so poor rate of access to numerical information. That's seen in the naming speed quantity test, the naming speed literacy test, item 3, where you're rapidly naming and alternating between letters and numbers. And she often needs, or she always needs extra time to complete math assignments. Processing speed may certainly be related to poor math fluency the coding subtest, for example, and I'll show you these scores in just a minute, but coding was lower, a lot lower than symbol search and cancellation. And it's unclear. It appears that was a spuriously low score. She does have anxiety related to math now. She doesn't have much self-confidence at all when it comes to math, which is very understandable because she's in the 5th grade now and she's been struggling with math for so many years. And so it could have been sort of related to the poor performance on coding could have been related to activation difficulty. So you look at the subtest, the coding subtest, you see the numbers, and all of a sudden you experience anxiety because you have to work with numbers. So it might be a spuriously low score for that reason. Otherwise, processing speed seems okay for her. Working memory comes into play for math problem solving, so higher level applications kinds of. So we're applying the basic skills. So key math, foundations of problem solving, and applied problem solving, both applications tests. Also, Holly has difficulty holding information long enough to use it, and that's been observed by her teacher, by her tutor. She needs visual supports when learning new math concepts, and she benefits quite well from visual supports. Now, her visual spatial ability is fine, and she does respond well to visual aids in learning. So that's really a plus when it comes to planning interventions for her. Certainly that's a plus that she benefits from. Well, that she benefits from strategies, and she also benefits from visuals. And then attention and executive function. There's the processing speed subtest that involves sustained attention, focus of attention, concentration. And then the addition of the Dellis-Kaplan verbal fluency category switching test and the color word interference inhibition switching test. Holly was diagnosed with ADHD inattentive type, and she is taking medication currently. So here's our WISC-5 performance and the supplemental data, which is primarily the Dellis-Kaplan. So GC is a 103, visual processing 97, fluid reasoning 94. You'll see that her working memory is poor, 76. Processing speed came up as an 86, but again, that's coding and symbol search, and we talked about some difficulties with coding. An alternative processing speed score for her, which I'll show you on XFAST, is a 97. Her full-scale IQ is an 81. Her GAI, General Ability Index, is 100. That's quite a difference in performance. And the difference is related to the working memory and processing speed that is part of the full-scale IQ, but not part of the General Ability Index. So we can talk a little bit more about those when we get more into the PSW case. Her naming speed index, that's her speed of lexical access index, 76. Symbol translation, or her associative memory, is 80. So the combination of both, which is a broader GLR composite, is a 74. And tests that measure inhibition, switching, set shifting is 79. And then the few math tests that she was administered from the KT3 and K-Math all are pretty low performances relative to her same age peers. So when we put all of this information together, right, we want to consider quantitative data, we want to consider qualitative data. It appears that she has a number of strengths, so that is areas that are at least average, right, crystallized, visual, fluid reasoning, processing speed, and phonetic coding, which I'll describe a little bit later. And then she has some pretty significant weaknesses, mainly in the memory areas, working memory and long-term storage and retrieval. She also demonstrates weaknesses in specific executive functioning. And they manifest, these weaknesses are manifesting for her in below average to well below average performances on basic concepts, operations, and applications on standardized math tests on the KC and on the Key Math. And all of that is very consistent with the qualitative data that were gathered in terms of why she was retained, why she needs tutoring in math, all of the supports that she needs in the classroom while she's engaged in math-related activities, her performance on state exams, the observations of her poor fluency, all the progress monitoring data, the lack of expected response to instruction and intervention. So these are all converging data sources that are leaning toward this is a specific learning disability in the area of mathematics. So how confident are we that Holly has a specific learning disability in the area of math calculation or math problem solving? Remember, I said it's primarily a clinical decision that has to do with the convergence of indicators, and all of this information appears to be supporting that, right? So we have strength. We have a score that suggests she has an average ability to think and reason, which would be her general ability index of 100. She has very specific weaknesses in memory areas. These weaknesses are manifesting for her in pretty significant ways on standardized tests, as well as this long history of qualitative and quantitative information. And all of this is converging really to support a specific learning disability in math. But in schools, we rely on numbers. We often rely heavily on formulas for consistency and for accountability. And it makes sense. We have to do that in schools. So, it becomes, well, what method are we using? Failure to respond, specific PSW, work samples, other qualitative information. And there's really no one right method. The data certainly don't support any one method as the method for SLD identification. And there's a lot of data and mounting data to discredit every single method that's out there. So, there's a lot of work to be done. And another reason why we need to rely on our clinical judgment and to look for converging data sources that support the SLD construct. So I believe that experienced and knowledgeable practitioners should consider, or do consider rather, multiple methods and multiple data sources to inform their decision. That's what we have to do. And so it's, is it this or this? Well, you have data from RTI, we have to use it, right? We have access to PSW analysis, let's use it, see what it shows. We have work samples, behavioral observations, other qualitative information, absolutely have to use it. Teacher reports, parent reports, talking to the student, him or herself, all of it necessary. All different sources of data, all different methods of gathering data, it's all important. And how do they converge or diverge? That's where the thinking comes in, and that's where our clinical skills come in to try to determine if we indeed have an individual who has a disorder in a basic psychological process that rises basically to the level of a disability. So in terms of PSW analysis, and I would say that by the time you're here and where we were here, you have a pretty good understanding of your data, and you're probably already saying to yourself, this looks like a pattern that would support a specific learning disability. But moving to, the consistency in the process and the accountability for the process, you might be using a PSW model. So I'm going to show you how this PSW model works. So in XFAST, this is the welcome screen. And we often think about PSW analysis as a quantitative check on your clinical judgment, right? So accountability is important, consistency is important, consistency in methodology in the schools, all important, but your thinking is primary, and you're gathering data and looking at different data sources, and then you sort of have your clinical impressions. And once you have those clinical impressions, then you say, okay, let's check it quantitatively. Let's see if it fits within this pattern. That's all that is consistent with a specific learning disability. So those of you who are new to XFAS and think it's completely overwhelming, you might not be alone. But those of you who are familiar with it and have used it with a few cases, you realize that you get the hang of it pretty quickly. But for those who are new, we put in a user mode, beginner, intermediate, and advanced. I suggest that if you're new to XFAS, you click the beginner mode and you go through the program in the beginner mode, because you'll get lots of pop-ups explaining it. Basically, it's a tutorial of the program. So you shouldn't have any problems if you're in beginner mode. Once you've done a few cases in beginner mode, my suggestion is you drop back to intermediate mode, because pop-ups can get annoying pretty quickly. So as you get more and more used to the program, drop down to intermediate, and then finally to advanced to get the least number of pop-ups, only the most important. Okay. So we're going to enter data on the Start and Data Record Management tab. So we enter name, date of evaluation, date of birth, age is automatically calculated, grade 5 should be in there. Then we're going to create the new record. Click on Create the New Record. Once you do that, it takes you to the WISC-5 tab. Or it takes you to the Index and Main Navigation tab. From there, you can click on your core battery. So we're clicking on our core battery, which is the WISC-5. This is the WISC-5 tab, and you start entering your WISC-5 data. So verbal comprehension is a 103 made up of similarities and vocabulary. What XFAS does is it looks at your composites or your indexes, and it determines if they're cohesive and whether or not follow-up is recommended. So cohesive composite means that the composite is a good summary of the theoretically related abilities it was intended to represent. If there's a significant and unusual difference between the scores, then the program will say it's not cohesive, and if the lower score is suggestive of a weakness or deficit, then the program's going to alert you to, hey, you probably want to follow up on that lower score. So it gives you that information. But here, verbal comprehension is cohesive. There's no need to follow up. So we're going to click on this button that says Transfer to Data Organizer tab. Now remember I said that it's good to have estimates, or you need to have estimates in the 7 areas, CHC areas. Well, once you're satisfied with your evaluation in an area, in this case GC, then we're going to send it over to what's called the Data Organizer tab. That Data Organizer tab is basically just a holding tank for your scores until you are ready to then use them in a PSW analysis. So first we have to analyze our scores, make sure we're not doing any follow-up, or if we don't need to do any follow-up, transfer them all over to the Data Organizer tab. Once we have all our estimates over there, then we can begin our PSW analysis. So that's what's happening here. Now, on the WISC-5 tab, there's a lot more to the WISC-5 tab than any of the other tabs because it follows the interpretive system in Essentials of WISC-5 Assessment. So you can see that there's a lot of text here. It describes what crystallized is. It does an analysis of the 5 primary indexes. It talks about where the score falls relative to most people, gives a percentile, does an interpretation, and so forth. So you get a lot more information, and it also puts all that information into a summary report. Okay, fluid reasoning, 94, cohesive, no need to follow up. We're going to click Transfer our GF score over to the Data Organizer tab. Now we're going to scroll down, right? We're going to scroll down on our WISC-5 tab. We're going to come to Visual Spatial, 97, no problems. We're going to transfer that over. Working memory. We have a low score in working memory, consistent across the working memory subtest. It's cohesive, no need to follow up. We're going to transfer that one over and continue to scroll down. and we scroll down and we get to processing speed. Now, processing speed, coding is a 6, symbol search is a 9. That means 6 and 9 are the scores that make up the 86, the processing speed index. The processing speed index is cohesive, but there's a recommendation to follow up on the lower score. Also on the WISC-5 tab, when there's a follow-up recommendation, it will give you examples of what you might want to do to follow up. So it gives you some suggestions for testing some hypotheses. We followed up with cancellation. Now, because of the issues that I raised about coding, it's likely that's a spurious score. So when you scroll down the WISC-5 tab, you get to the new clinical composite, and there's a perceptual speed clinical composite made up of symbol search and cancellation. Since we already entered symbol search and cancellation, they're automatically populated in the clinical composite section, and the actual norms are generated automatically. And so perceptual speed is a 97. Then we can go ahead and transfer that over to the data organizer tab. Okay, now we come to naming speed index, symbol translation index, cohesive composites. No need to follow up in these areas. One's a 76 naming speed, symbol translation index is an 80. Now, the storage and retrieval index is made up of both of these indexes. So storage and retrieval is naming speed plus symbol search, symbol translation. So naming speed, symbol translation make up storage and retrieval index. And so the storage and retrieval index, which is an estimate of GLR, broad GLR, is the most parsimonious score for representing GLR. So we're going to go ahead and transfer that one over. We don't need to transfer all 3 or 2 separately. We can just summarize it in this storage and retrieval index. So we'll transfer that to the data organizer tab. Now GA. Now, do we need to measure GA, auditory processing? Well, remember, the way in which we measure it, it's usually phonetic coding, and we know that Holly does not have difficulties with reading. She reads at grade level. She can decode words that she doesn't recognize automatically. We know that. So do I need to give a GA measure? Well, GA is necessary to conduct a PSW analysis. So we don't want to do over-testing, right? That's always an issue. But since it's necessary for PSW analysis, what do? Is a single subtest sufficient? Well, a single subtest is sufficient if there are other data available to support it. So in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through. I was going to demonstrate some things with CTOP and XPath, but I need to skip through those because I don't want to run out of time and I want to get through all my slides. But so I'll just stick right with Holly. So Holly, we know that she can read. We know she does fine in reading. So is a single subtest ever enough? Well, in this case, the CTOP2, it's blending words. She scored a 9 or a 95. And there's a lot of other data, obviously, to support that she can read. So we have progress monitoring data from past years. We have her current reading performance. We have teacher reports and so forth. We have our own observations. So there's a lot of ecological validity to support her CTOP2. So I'm on the Other Data Entry tab. Okay, so this is a relatively new tab, Other Data Entry. You can type in anything you want, any way you want it. So I went right to the auditory processing section here. I typed in CTOP2, blending words, progress monitoring, plus ecological validity. Right? So I'm saying I have progress monitoring data and ecological validity to support this 95 CTOP2 blending words. And then I'm going to transfer that over to the data organizer tab. And now I have my estimate of GA. Now, once you have all your estimates, you go to the data organizer tab, and you can see that they're all over there. Here's my GC, GF, GLR, etc. Visual, and here's auditory. And they're all clearly labeled as such. All right. Her global ability scores. So she has a full scale IQ of 81, remember that full-scale IQ is low because of the working memory and coding subtests. Her general ability index is a better estimate of her general cognitive ability or her ability to think and reason without the attenuating effects of cognitive efficiency or cognitive proficiency, her in particular working memory, not necessarily her processing speed. Unfortunately, the full-scale IQ, when it was obtained, it included coding, so it included a low score. So it should have been calculated with a different subtest, but this is what the evaluator did. But the GAI is a good estimate. Cognitive Proficiency Index 78. Now, here you can see WISC-5 report. You can click on the WISC-5 report, and it's a summary. It's just a summary. So it's not a report writer. It's just a summary of information. And so as you scroll down, what you see is, any identifying information that you may have entered. You can enter more information. Here's a description of your global ability scores. And here is a description of interpretation of overall intellectual ability. So the program actually looks at the scores you entered and looks at how you are, the kind of referral that you have. So, for example, on this slide, which is the beginning of the interpretive summary report, it says, is the individual suspected of having a speech-language impairment, expressive language disorder, or any other disorder that may compromise expressive or receptive language? If you click yes, the program will look at the full-scale IQ versus the NVI and give you a rationale as to which score you might want to consider as the best estimate and why. Same is true if you click, is the examinee an English learner? If you click yes there, then the program will do the same thing. It'll compare the full-scale IQ, the NVI, on a number of different characteristics and give you a recommendation as to which might be the best estimate to report and why. If you don't click either one of those, then what the program will do is it will automatically compare the full-scale IQ and the GAI. So, for example, for Holly, it says the difference between the full-scale IQ and GAI and the CPI and GAI are unusual, occurring in about 10% of the general population, and the GAI is higher than the full-scale IQ and CPI. Talks about the variability, gives a recommendation, and so forth. So it's very specialized in terms of what it reports and how it reports it. Here's a description of the primary index and subtest scaled scores. So it gives you the scores, it gives you the normative categories, it tells you whether or not there's strengths or weaknesses. So GC is an uncommon personal strength, so that's pretty unusual given all of her other scores that she scored as high in verbal comprehension, and working memory is highlighted as a high priority concern. And so then the report continues. Here's the verbal index and then verbal comprehension index, and then as you scroll down, you get information on all the other indexes and whether, if you gave ancillary indexes, that's there, complementary, and so forth. Okay, on to achievement data. So math concepts and applications from the K-2-3. I'm going to transfer that over to the XBA Analyzer tab. The reason I'm transferring it over there is because I want to combine it with the other math problem-solving tests from the Key Math. So I'm going to click on Transfer Subtest to XBA Analyzer tab, and there you see it goes to the XBA Analyzer tab right under Math Problem Solving, where it should, and then I'm going to go to the drop-down menu and select my key math tests that I administered, enter those scores. The program then calculates a composite. This composite is a math problem solving composite of 77. How is the composite calculated? It's calculated based on median reliabilities of math problem solving tests and median intercorrelations among math problem solving tests. And then it uses a standard formula to calculate the composite, much in the same way as test developers calculate composites on tests. Okay, so we transfer that over. And here are my math calculation tests. So again, on the XDA Analyzer tab, math calculation tests from the key math. I enter those. I get a composite. I transfer that over to the Data Organizer tab. So you can see here's now my most parsimonious summary score of math calculation, most parsimonious summary score of math problem solving. Also gave some executive function tests. So you have the DCAS test here. This is a special place on the XDA Analyzer tab for more neuropsych kinds of tests. And so we have an executive function composite here of 79, which we're going to transfer over to the Organizer tab. Now, on the Data Organizer tab, you can only see the first part of the tab, and this is the cognitive data in blue. If you scroll below that, you get all the achievement data in purple, and if you scroll below that, you get the neuropsych data in beige. So all the data are now on this Data Organizer tab, and at this point, we're ready to do our PSW analysis. We can click this button that says Select All Checkboxes, and then every score that was transferred to this Data Organizer tab is automatically selected for use in PSW analysis. Now, from this, within XFAS, every time you click on the top right button, you get to the next step in the process. Every time you click on the in the PSW process. Once you start the PSW process, you can click on the top left to go backwards, top right to go forward in the process. So after we select all checkboxes, we want to select this Strengths and Weaknesses Indicator tab. It's a analysis of Holly's strengths and weaknesses. And so this is the Strengths and Weaknesses tab, and this is where you have to select your scores as representing either strengths or weaknesses for Holly. How do you do that? Well, we say you can use your clinical judgment in doing that. So we could have programmed this such that any score of 90 or higher was considered a strength and anything below 90 was considered a weakness. But that doesn't make sense, especially when you are right around a cut point. So, you say, what's the difference between an 89 and a 91? Nothing. So why would an 89, be a weakness and a 91 be a strength? If an 89 is the highest score or one of the highest scores in a child's profile, that's a strength for the child. And as a clinician, you should be able to mark that as a strength in your analysis of their pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So, but usually we say, as a guideline, if the area, so let's say verbal comprehension of 103, if that, in your judgment, is not likely to be interfering with performance, and if anything, it may be facilitating performance for the child, right, then that's a strength. But if the area is likely to be inhibiting performance, like storage and retrieval, for example, then that's a weakness. And so you have to click Strengths and Weaknesses for your cognitive areas and your achievement areas and any other special areas that you may have assessed, like orthographic processing. And then you click on PSW Data Summary, top right. And that's exactly what it says it is. It's a summary of your data. So you can see all the areas in green that you selected as strengths, the areas in red that you selected as weaknesses. The program reports a G-value. The G-value reflects overall cognitive ability based on the CHC abilities judged by the evaluator to be strengths. So it's interpreted according to the likelihood that an individual possesses at least average overall cognitive ability. And that's based on G-weight. So every area has a G-weight. And so the more areas you have as strengths, and the more areas you have as strengths that have high G-weight, the greater the likelihood is that you'll have a solid and strong G-value. And the G-value, if it is 0.60 or higher, basically suggests that despite some cognitive weaknesses, this is an individual who has generally average ability to think and reason, or generally average overall cognitive ability. And so if the G-value suggests that, which in this case it does, then the program calculates a facilitating cognitive composite. The facilitating cognitive composite is based on all the areas that are strengths. That's a 96. It also calculates an inhibiting cognitive composite, which is a summary of your areas of weakness. The composites are calculated using a formula that uses median reliabilities of each of these areas. So median reliabilities for all the areas that are strengths for the formula for the FCC, as well as the median intercorrelations among all of the areas of strength, and then uses the standard formula to calculate the composite. So the composite is an estimate of G. It's like a proxy for G, or general intelligence. Okay, so this is just a summary page. Then you click on G value, also a summary page. It tells you what the G value is. The G value basically answers the question, how likely is it that the individual's pattern of strengths indicates at least average overall cognitive ability, and then it answers that question. So again, just a summary page. And then you click on PSW analysis, and here's where your analysis is performed. Now, what this shows here is your top oval, your facilitating cognitive composite is 96, representing generally average ability to think and reason. And the program in the cognitive weakness oval defaults to an inhibiting cognitive composite. The inhibiting cognitive composite is 71. Over here in the academic weakness area, in this drop-down menu, anything that you said was an academic weakness is listed in this drop-down menu. So the first thing the program does is it looks at the difference between the facilitating cognitive composite and your cognitive weakness, and it says, is that a statistically significant difference? Here the program says, yes, it is, so that difference is real. Then, if it's a significant difference, the program uses the 96 in a regression-based analysis to predict where this person was expected to perform in the cognitive domain, expected to perform a 97. The difference between predicted and actual performance is almost 26 points. It meets or exceeds a critical value, which means that that difference occurs in about 10% or less of the population, indicating that it is a domain-specific cognitive weakness. Then on this side, the program looks at, takes the facilitating composite and says, is it significantly different? Is there a significant difference between facilitating cognitive composite and the academic area of weakness, which is math calculation, and this is math calculation without fluency, which is an 82, and that difference is statistically significant. And then when used in a regression-based analysis to predict where Holly was expected to perform in math calculation, that difference between predicted and expected, which is rounds to about 16 points, but doesn't quite meet, very, very close, it doesn't quite meet the critical value. Therefore, it's not considered unexpected underachievement. The consistency, however, between the areas that make up the inhibiting cognitive composite, which are your memory areas, and math calculation, yes, that's consistent. They're both weaknesses, the 71 and the 82, both weaknesses, and the strength of the relationship between these memory areas and math calculation is moderate. So that's a consistent relationship. However, we don't have the criterion of unexpected underachievement. Well, let's continue to do more analysis. So in the other thing that I can do is this is math calculation with fluency, right? So math calculation with fluency is a 79. When you look at this relationship now with math calculation, when it also involves fluency, you get unexpected underachievement, and all the other criteria, of course, are met. And then this next one looks at this. Now what's changed here is math problem solving. Okay, so now we're selected math problem solving. So with the inhibiting cognitive composite, we have domain-specific cognitive weakness, we have unexpected underachievement, but it says that the strength of the relationship between these memory abilities and math problem solving is low. And so the consistency then says possibly use clinical judgment. Well, I think it's important to know that whenever there's the inhibiting cognitive composite, demonstrates a relationship of low, then you should go to the drop-down menu and select the processes separately rather than the combined processes in the ICC. So if I do that, I select storage and retrieval. I look at its relationship to math problem solving. It says it's low. If I look at working memory and its relationship to math problem solving, now I have a high relationship. So I've met my PSW for math calculation with fluency, and I've met the PSW criterion with working memory and its relationship to math problem solving. So in each area of math, when we look at the PSW, we have generally average ability to think and reason. We have unexpected underachievement in math. We have domain-specific cognitive weakness, and we have an empirically established relationship between our cognitive areas of weakness and our academic areas of weakness. We can scroll down on that PSW tab, and the questions related to the PSW, is there evidence of domain-specific, is there evidence of unexpected, is there evidence of below average, all of those are answered there. You can print this out. And finally, diagnostic impressions. Holly struggles in math. She's been struggling since early elementary school. Very little progress in math in RTI despite interventions. Difficulty in many skills that are associated with math disorders, number sense, memorization of math facts, etc. Weaknesses or deficits in cognitive processes that underlie math skills, naming facility, associative memory, working memory, including symbolic working memory, number facility, difficulties with attentional control that may interfere. She has anxiety that may interfere. She has a history with quantitative and qualitative data most closely aligned with dyscalculia. So she meets criteria for SLD and math calculation and math problem solving following the BBC PSW model, which is very consistent with all of the neuropsych and CAC literature that we reviewed quickly here. With a greater understanding of the underlying cognitive processing weaknesses that are contributing to her math difficulties, a systematic and tailored instructional and remedial program can be devised that will very likely lead to a more positive response compared to previous approaches. And I would say that that's part 2. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thank you.
Dr. Flanagan?
Yes.
We do have a few questions. Do you have time to answer a couple?
Yes.
Okay, what is the process in the situation when a cognitive weakness is not identified, however, there does exist an academic weakness?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. When you don't have, based on your evaluation, if there's no evidence of cognitive processing weaknesses, but you do have academic skill weaknesses, then it suggests a couple of things. One, is your evaluation sensitive enough to the specific cognitive abilities and processes most closely associated with those academic areas? So following the literature like I reviewed here, do you have measures of each of those areas? Have you, explored that? And 2, have you explored the exclusionary factors in enough detail and a great enough depth to be able to rule them out as the primary cause of the academic skill weaknesses? The other is to also look at some other issues like planning, organization, self-monitoring. Oftentimes those more behavioral issues, some would say executive functions, interfere when your cognitive data looks fine, but the executive functions are impaired. And so that's not really captured on the cognitive test because the cognitive tests are so structured. So I would consider that as well.
Okay, and we are using the XPath 1.4. Is it necessary to update it ASAP to the 2.0, or is using the 1.4 still okay?
Using 1.4 is still okay. What we do when we keep upgrading is, well, 1.4, if you're a WISC 5 user, you're probably going to want 2.0 because then you get the whole interpretive system with the WISC 5 on the WISC 5 tab and the summary report and all of that. We also add new tests, with upgrades. We also fix some minor glitches or some inconsistencies in classifications. XPath has over 135 batteries and over 1,000 subtests. So occasionally we come across some glitches and some inconsistencies that we fix. So it's really up to you. But I would say that the main change for version 2.0 was the WISC 5 tab. I mean, the WISC 5 tab was a significant upgrade. The other is we're getting ready to release. So if you have 2.0, there's already been a new release. It's 2.0.1, which, again, minor changes and changes with functionality. And we're probably within the next month or so going to version 2.1, which is a free upgrade. And that one will have some significant changes on the XDA Analyzer tab that allow you to do different things with your scores that you weren't permitted to do prior to that version. And it significantly improves the clinical utility of the tool. And that'll all be explained on a new tab for that version.
Okay, well, we are past time, so I want to thank Dr. Flanagan for an awesome webinar presentation and thank all the participants. And this does conclude our webinar for today.